Hi, Empty Inside listeners. I wanted to come on here real quick before getting to today's.
Hi, Empty Inside listeners. I am coming at you from my bed. I've got my comforter pulled up over my head, and it is getting quite toasty in here. I feel like I am about to suffocate. But I'm recording my intro this way because I did one of these little intro spiels last week as well, not under the covers, and the sound was not very good. There was a lot of echo. So hopefully this sound will be better, and I will not have suffocated in the process of recording it this way, so that I will be able to know whether it turned out better or not. Anyway, I wanted to come on here ahead of time, ahead of the episode, to let you guys know that I have merch. We have Empty Inside merch, baby. I'm so excited. I absolutely love the hoodie design. Think it's so fun. I've been loving reading the comments from you guys who have already pre-ordered one. If you're interested in pre-ordering a hoodie yourself, they ship out the week of October 30th, and you can find links to the merchandise website through my Instagram, my TikTok, my Twitter, my, dear God, how many are there? My Facebook. I think that's all of them. My website and the Empty Inside website and everything else that exists. Every other platform that exists. I guarantee you can find a link to my Empty Inside merch website through my accounts on those platforms. All right. That's all, guys. And also, if you order a hoodie, once you receive it, snap a little picture of yourself in it and post it to Instagram, because I will be featuring you guys in my Instagram story. All right. Enjoy the episode. Hi, Jennette. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much for doing this. I have been a fan of yours for a long time. I'm a very loyal This American Life listener, and you produced my favorite episode that I've ever heard, Tell Me I'm Fat, as well as some of my other favorites, 5 Women I loved, 10 Sessions. And then I stumbled on your memoir, Empty, and was so blown away. I might get emotional talking about it here. I have rarely been so deeply affected by a piece of writing. Wow, I would listen to your audiobook on walks, and so many moments would cause me to just sit down on the curb of somebody's house and process what I just heard, which I feel like is the truest testament of having just heard truth, is that feeling of, wow, I need to just sit with this and let this kind of penetrate every part of me. And that's what your book did for me. So firstly, thank you for writing it. And second, thank you for coming on here to talk with me more about it.
Oh my gosh. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And what you just said, I mean, that's like, it means a ton to me. I mean, the fact that the words resonated that way so that you sort of slowed down and sat with them. I mean, that's like any writer's dream, but it's also really important to me as somebody who's had one of these illnesses, knowing that you're also somebody who's had one or more of these illnesses. It just, yes. It just means a lot to me that you connected with it on that level.
Oh my God. Yeah. You skewered eating disorders, the reality of them. I was hoping today, and I messaged you about this, but to speak with you kind of about adolescence, but maybe even more specifically about how eating disorders paved yours and my adolescent experiences. Or is that something you're still comfortable talking about?
Totally.
Awesome. I feel like a good place to start might be if you could just give the listeners here kind of a timeline of your history with eating disorders, because I assume we'll be jumping around. So just so everybody has kind of some context.
Yeah, that's perfect. I mean, so I think with eating disorders, like, there's often a moment where you can be like, okay, this is the moment my eating disorder started. But then before that moment, there's always kind of like a timeline leading up to that moment. So I'll tick through some of the dots on that timeline. And I hope I won't weary you or the listener by saying the timeline essentially starts in 1973 when I was born.
They often do.
But it's like food was a part of my story from the start. My mother talks about when I was a baby, I would be in the high chair and she would try and like put a bite of rice cereal in my mouth, and I would just like tighten my lips and turn away. When she went to my first parent-teacher conference at preschool, they told her Susan doesn't eat snack. And she wasn't surprised because at home she had so much trouble getting food into me. And I really remember being a preschool child in that classroom and like the little low round snack table and the little chairs and children sitting in those chairs and me standing to the side with my hands behind my back, observing them. And I think that image stays with me because I always felt somehow outside the world of food, of just like ease in eating, of just being able to like sidle up to the snack table in preschool and take a handful of saltines. I was scared of food as a kid. I was scared of not liking tastes. I was scared of feeling sick. I was scared, the way I would put it is like of something getting in me that I could never get out. But I didn't want anybody to know how scared I was of food. And so early on, I had stuff around food that I was hiding, and it felt like a little shameful. So then, okay, so sort of fast forward ahead, when I was 9, I went on my first diet. And that, that was triggered by a lot of things, kind of the cultural soup of the early 80s. Tab, just 1 calorie, and Special K, and Can You Pinch an Inch? And I grew up in a family that was really focused on appearance and size. And also that year was sort of an intense year for me emotionally. And I don't think it's a coincidence that sort of my first like bout with dieting, need to control food happened in response to like kind of some interior stuff that felt out of control. I got my period when I was 10. Which was really destabilizing. 10 is early to get your period, and especially so in 1984. I didn't know anybody else who had their period that early.
Wow.
And I had all the things that went along with my period. I had hips and breasts and a waist, and I had, and all the stuff that like nobody had ever told me about. Like, I was ovulating, and in the middle of the month, I had like egg white mucus and discharge. And like, so my day of the week underpants would be like, what was this stuff coming out of me? Like, I was just so scared. I didn't like my body. And I was a little girl who was like so focused on little girlhood. Like I had no interest in like Barbies or the future in which I would be like, later I developed an interest in like teenage girlhood and adolescence. But at that point, I didn't feel like myself anymore. Okay, so then now we're getting closer to the actual kind of like pathology. But when I was 15, I caught a stomach bug and I, lost some water weight. And it wasn't a lot, but I liked the feeling of being just like a little bit lighter. And I sought more of that feeling that I craved. It just felt like this unburdening. And within a few months, I'd lost my period. I was anorexic. And then within a few months after that, I started binge eating. This is the beginning of my junior year of high school, 1989. Like a lot of people who go from like the anorexia to binge eating trajectory, I had no idea what was happening to me. I had no idea this was a thing. I just felt this massive loss of control and self-loathing. And then the binging basically defined the rest of my adolescence, my early college years. I swung back to anorexia in my early 20s. And that sort of like endured throughout my adulthood. I'm 46 now. So that's the big picture.
Thank you. That's very, I very much relate to the pendulum swing of eating disorders. So that listeners have some context for my history as well. It's like 11 was when anorexia began for me. And that was my mom, with my mom's encouragement. I was a child actor, and she would outright tell me that if I had a smaller body, I would be able to play younger roles, which would be beneficial for my career and in turn the family's financial stability. So from 11 to 14, I had intense anorexia. It was the thing that I thought about most. I also really want to touch on the obsession with childhood because I felt that so deeply. I wanted nothing to do with becoming a teenager or a woman or the training bras that were happening with the girls around me and the boys. Just leave it all to the side. I wanted to stay young, stay a child, stay innocent, stay pure. So I was very fixated on that from 11 to 14. And then I got my period very late. I was 16. I was on set, and the studio teacher hugged me and said, "Congratulations on becoming a woman," which is the absolute worst thing that anyone could have ever said to me at that time. And then I sobbed, and the makeup artist, like, wiping concealer under my tired 16-year-old eyes. And then I had to go out and do some scene that I will forever hate because of my memory attached to that. And then,
oh my God, what was the scene? What was the scene?
It was the scene where I was like in the school hallway, and there were some jokes about me. I was always like, I played a delinquent, a juvie delinquent. So there were some jokes about that. And I remember just feeling like so uncomfortable. And I felt like everyone around me knew what had just happened and knew that I was no longer myself, that I was no longer free, that I was now burdened by womanhood, which had just been bestowed upon me. It was this soul crushing weight that oh my God, that was so traumatizing. Is not too extreme of a word. And then by, let's see, so 16, I got my period, and by 18, and then I went back to anorexia. My eating had kind of normalized once I started working on the show. And then the period sent me back into anorexia because I did not want to get a period again, which I achieved for about a year and a half. And then my mom got cancer again when I was 18, which then led me to binge eating until I was 21 when my mom died, which then led to bulimia for 3 years. So that's the nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
But I think it's very common that people swing from one to another. And I feel like very many women with eating disorders relate to that experience. Would you agree?
Oh my gosh, totally. And I think that's the thing I didn't really realize until I started looking at my hard at my own experience and talking to other people about their own experience, and realizing that most people with eating disorders really do, in fact, have more than one of them.
Yes. You mentioned how eating was always kind of a part of your existence, but do you have a first memory of when there was something that you wanted to change about your body?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I think it was that summer that I was 9 that I went on that diet. There was a little girl. So we were on swim team. There was a little girl at the pool, and she was just like a little twig, and she was so thin that the leg holes of her swimsuit gaped, and I wanted the leg holes of my swimsuit to gape. So, it wasn't about being sexy or attractive. Like it was about being really small. And I remember that summer, like the feeling of like being in my body for the first time in a way that's familiar to me now, like a feeling of discomfort about my body that I hadn't felt previously, like when I was a kid, like kind of, touching my swimsuit or pulling on my swimsuit or like getting ready to go up to the blocks to swim a race. And instead of, looking ahead to the end of the pool, like looking down at my body. Yeah, it was like that summer I was 9. When did it happen for you?
Well, I would say I very much felt how my mom was affected by her body and her kind of obsession with appearance and staying thin. That was always in the background for me. Yeah. But it didn't really affect me until there was one day when so my mom first had cancer when I was 2. And there was one day when my nipple had slightly started to swell. It was, my breast was developing on one side a little bit before the other, which often happens. And I had told my mom, like, I'm worried about this. I'm worried that I have cancer. And she felt it and said, "Oh no, you're just getting boobies." And then introduced me immediately to calorie restriction. I did not know that was a thing. I had no awareness of I didn't know what a calorie was. I'm sure I had heard fat grams in passing, or I'd maybe heard my mom speaking with my grandma about, we got to lose weight, but that was the extent of it. So then to be introduced to the literal concept of calorie restriction at that age by my mom, who's endorsing me staying small, it just felt like all the ducks were in a row for it to become the hellish chaos that it then
oh my God,
became
how could
for
it
the
not
next few
have
years.
For you?
Right?
I mean, it was explicitly connected to your burgeoning sexuality. Oh my God.
Right. Yeah. You had mentioned that how your family, or the women in your family at least, had this interesting relationship with stomachs or with their body. And there was this great line about your grandmother on her deathbed, which I won't ruin for people listening. But can you kind of go into how your relatives' relationship with their bodies and with food informed yours?
Sure. So the women in my family and honestly my father too were really obsessed with size. I'll talk about my father first and then move to the women. But my father, when I was growing up, he was a really serious amateur athlete, triathlete, a marathoner. And there was like a 1970s bestseller called Fit or Fat that he was obsessed with. And he would also get like obsessed with certain foods, like shredded wheat, in a way that I recognize now as an eating disordered person, like becoming fixated on like a certain food that's like your safe food that you need to eat. So he definitely played a role in it too. And I guess I feel like sometimes mothers bear, they take a lot of hits for eating and food stuff.
Sure.
And so I want to just, give a shout out to my father too. But yeah, so the women in my family, there was a lot of focus on food as like a source of pleasure. Like everybody was a great cook, but there's also a lot of vigilance around food. And it was like a real obsession with the stomach. Like my mother was always talking about her little pot belly. All of the women in my family live in very small bodies. Nobody, would have ever gone to the doctor and been off like the BMI charts in the direction they didn't want to be. But I, like them, was sort of fixated on my stomach right away. I guess if there's like a part, for years, my stomach was the part that like, as soon as I woke up, that was the first thing I would check, whether my stomach was flat or out or in. I mean, literally for decades, that was the first thing I would check. And even now when I'm very much still working toward recovery and my stomach is still the thing that can like really send me down a bad spiral. I mean, there's a story I tell in the book about being 13 years old and having a friend over for sleepover. And early in the morning, I woke up and I heard my parents across the hall. And my father was talking to my mother. My father could be emotionally cruel. And he was berating her that morning. And I heard him say to my mother, "You're disgusting. You disgust me." And then he left the room and went downstairs and went out the front door to go running. And the thought that came into my head at that moment was that if there was something that disgusted my father about my mother, it must be her body and it must be her stomach. Like that's where my head went. So that had to come from somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And it's no surprise to me that the part I fixated on was my stomach. But then my grandmother, so the thing you're mentioning from the book, so when she was dying in her early 90s, she was in her early 90s, I was 37 or 38, and I went down to Florida to say goodbye to her. And I was sitting beside her bed and like literally her deathbed. And at one point she said, I know I've lost so much weight. I wish I had the energy to get out of bed and get on the scale. I would just love to know how much I weigh.
Dear God.
I know.
It killed me.
I know. But the thing was, I understood.
Yes.
At that point, I mean, like I was a woman in my late 30s, the mother of 2 children. And part of the reason I'd even been able to just kind of like hop on a flight and get right down there and go see my grandmother is because I felt thin, which you would, to use the word that I would have used in my head then, like I felt empty. I felt in control. I felt kind of like spectral. I felt that I was like closer to my feelings, all things I recognize now as fallacies. But if I'd felt heavy or weighted down, I would have felt distracted. I wouldn't have felt as present for her. So anyway, so I completely connected to what she was saying. And now, now I'm in a very different place. And I feel sad that my grandmother still had those feelings in her early 90s. And I am doing my best not to, have the same outcome for myself.
Right. My mother, when she got cancer, her second bout with cancer, and when I was 18 to 21, when she eventually passed, she was losing a lot of weight from chemotherapy. And it was puzzling on the one hand, but made total sense on the other. How delighted she was by losing weight because of the chemotherapy. Her body was deteriorating. She looked like a person who was dying. She did not look like, just a thin woman walking down the street. She looked like exactly what she was, which was dying. And yet she would all but squeal with delight that she had, was at her lowest weight. And also this is very small. She was 4'11". So she's very, very petite naturally. And watching her, I felt angry at her, angry at how she could be focused on her weight when she was dying, when she was about to disappear from all of us, and also strangely relatable. I now see how disturbed that part of me was, but it was a part of me that was very, very real at the time. So I totally get the story with your grandma. I very, very much see how the mind goes there in that state.
I want to ask you though about height, because I think I read are you 5'2"? Is that how tall you are?
I'm 5'2".
Okay, so I'm 5 feet.
Oh, okay.
My grandmother, was also, she was like 5'1" or 5'2".
Yeah.
All of the women in my family are very small. And, I can't say what effect that has had on them, but I do feel like for me, my height has played a role in my relationship to size. I feel like I had a real fixation on smallness, like of all kinds, and maybe even a stronger pull to little girlhood because I am diminutive. I don't know if you think about your height in relation to your eating disorder or your mother's eating disorder, but it was just striking to me when you said that your mother was 4'11", and I know that you're small too.
No, absolutely. My mother, I'm just now kind of formulating this, so it will be sloppy. But my mom, I felt most connected to her, and I felt like she was very erratic, very unstable, very emotional highs and lows every day, tumultuous relationship with my dad, just a real extreme level of dysfunction and chaos. But when she seemed happiest was when she seemed most childlike, when she would do these little dances, when she would just kind of move in this free, almost fairy-like, pixie-like sort of way. I think I noted that was when she seemed happiest. So I'm sure that influenced me. And then also for myself, it was very much a child's body, a child's mentality, the innocence and the purity of childhood, and the fixation on, if I'm small, all these things that I want, all the person that I'm meant to be will be. If I'm squatty or lumpy or have extra pieces on my body, and then I will be further removed from who I am deep down, which is this childlike spirit or whatever it was that I was telling myself. But I would say absolutely the height played a huge factor, and I had never thought of that before.
Yeah.
I just want to delve more into this little girl area, because I think that's a pretty particular piece, and I hadn't seen anybody really articulate that aspect before. It was definitely more staying a child than it was being, I think a lot of times it's easy to think of eating disorders as somebody being vain and shallow and wanting to be very sexually appealing. And it was I did not want to be sexually appealing. I was disgusted by boys. I saw them only as a distraction. That was, again, a lot of my mom's narrative coming into my psyche. But I wanted to keep them at arm's length. As I saw my friends, 12 was I would say the most pivotal age probably in my life. Maybe 12 and 21 when my mom passed. But at 12, all my friends that was when they started liking boys. That was when they started getting training bras, which was the horror of my existence. Going into a Target or a Walmart would send me in a spiral where I would just feel like I might pass out. I would be dizzied because I feared my mom saying, "Let's get you a training bra." Of course, it was years before I would even need one. But it was that I was living in this constant fear of, oh God, when is that going to happen? When is this thing going to happen? This thing that I associate with the weightiness of womanhood and the just bogged down sense of developing and aging. I still try to put it into words and struggle. But where do you think this fascination with little girlhood started? Was it trauma that you were fleeing from? Was it that you wanted to stay young because of romanticizing your youth? Was it that you feared aging? What do you think was at the root of it?
It's a really good question, and I don't know that I have the answer to it. I mean, as a little girl, I was really into like the culture of little girlhood. Like, so I was like the right age to be at like peak Annie mania. I mean,
Okay.
I just loved Annie. I mean, I was cast in like a community theater production of Annie in Grand Rapids, Michigan in 1984. And like still one of the peak moments of my life is when like the director introduced like, you know, the orphans to the rest of the cast. And he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the cream of the crop." And I still feel so proud that I was an orphan in Annie. And I was really into Shirley Temple.
Okay.
I felt really at home in little girlhood. And, you know, I think I probably was frightened of sexuality, but I couldn't have maybe it was so big and frightening that I couldn't name it.
Mm-hmm.
And why that is, I mean, that is something that it's probably going to take me a couple years more of therapy to really figure out. I mean, I will say that it's very painful to me now to think of, you know, so those breasts and those hips and that body that I really wanted to get rid of for years. And really, you know, throughout most of my 20s and 30s and early 40s, maintained, you know, a very small size. Like I'm at the stage where the curves are coming back and I'm able to enjoy them for the first time. And it's
amazing.
Like, it is amazing. It is amazing, but it's sad to me that I'm 46 years old. You know what I mean? I sort of went from like preteen to perimenopause. And it's like not a trajectory that I recommend. And I think it is going to be really important for me to identify what was so scary about growing older. But your story is so compelling to me though, because the thing I wanted so bad, like I wanted to be a child star. I would have loved to be a child actor. And so
really?
It's like, so oh my God, yes. Oh my God, yes. I don't know if you've ever read, there's this novel called Anywhere But Here by Mona Simpson. That's just like one of my favorite books of all time. And the first line is like, my mother and I'm going to mangle it, but my mother and I were driving, you know, in a car from Wisconsin to Los Angeles so that I could be a child star while I was still a child. Like that. That was my fantasy. So, but it, you know, but it took this really destructive turn for you because it was like to be a child star, you had to remain a child and force yourself, into being a child, even when you no longer were one, it sounds like.
Right. Yeah. And my mom's dream for me I would just see it fading into the distance and I could feel her loving me less if the older that I got without having achieved whatever level of success she wanted me to achieve when I was young. And I'm not sure what that represented for her or why she was so fixated on my youth, but she would say things like, "I don't see the point in living once you grow up." And it was just this very, very extreme messaging of adult equals bad. Adult equals we won't be close anymore. I won't love you anymore. So it was like, I better stay young because the love of my mother and the financial stability of my family is depending on it. It was not very fun.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
I want to kind of cover this umbrella of like avoiding intimacy, which really came up a lot in your book that I feel like in some ways ties into the apprehension towards sexuality, but in a different way, because intimacy obviously isn't inherently sexual. But it's this piece that I think is so key in so many stories of the way I say it is I was only intimate with food. I was not intimate with people. Yeah. People didn't know me. I suppressed so intensely and so constantly. I didn't know myself. You know, the kids bean burrito from El Pollo Loco that I would eat a quarter of and then fixate on the other 3 quarters that I hadn't eaten. That's what knew me. Like that, that burrito knew me.
Yeah, I feel like I know your burrito, even though it wasn't my own. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. When did you start recognizing that maybe your eating disorders were an attempt to avoid intimacy? Was this something that you realized in the thick of them, or did it really take you getting to the other side of them in any way, shape, or form before you were able to identify that?
I think it wasn't until later.
Yeah.
I mean, there's kind of two things. One is I was conscious of my longing for intimacy and closeness and connection. I was really conscious of that longing as an adolescent. And, for example, I had this best friend senior year, Jules, and she was just, it was one of those intense best friend friendships. It was I don't know, maybe it was Angela and Rayanne from My So-Called Life. And she was kind of the Rayanne and I was the Angela, just sort of looking up at this kind of starry, wilder figure that I was sort of enthralled to. I always wanted to be closer to her than I felt she wanted to be close to me. And I would often leave interactions with her feeling kind of deflated that we hadn't had this communion of souls that I craved. And I would go home and binge. But I wouldn't have consciously connected those two at the time. And then I also don't think I realized that later, when I was anorexic, that my fixation on food was keeping me from intimacy because, that was all I thought about because I was hungry all the time. So food was the site of my deepest desires and longings. And, I wasn't going to stay, at the party. I was going to go home and eat, or I wasn't going to be able to meet the person for brunch because I needed to go running. Mm-hmm. And so I don't think I realized that it was keeping me from intimacy, even though I thought that not eating was the thing that was making everything possible for me. And, and I guess the way, the thing that's happened for me now is that I kept this stuff hidden for so long that now talking about it has for me really been a route back to intimacy and connection in a way that feels really good. I don't know what was your experience with food and that stuff.
I wrote down this passage that I felt in my soul.
Yeah.
It was the eating and later not eating increased the distance between me and whomever I kept at arm's length and was in the first place probably a reaction to that gap, a way to cope with some discomfort or shyness. But then it protected me from having to ever probe those feelings. I will not commit to you, though I am here. My real life is elsewhere. Mm-hmm. That so hit me. It was I wanted so desperately to connect with people, but felt unable to and terrified of abandonment or of putting myself out there in such a way that would then be rejected or not met equally. It was really important for me to have equal relationships.
Same. Oh my God.
And I felt I always felt things deeper and things always mattered more. And I couldn't put my finger on why. And it was devastating and confusing to me. Why am I taking this experience in on such a deep level? And I just feel it's just just hanging out for you.
Right.
More specifically, I would say that was with probably men than female friendships. Unfortunately, I would have preferred it probably bled more into female friendships, but that to me, it was always if I have food, then you don't really have to know me. Then I don't really have to feel the rejection because I've got this other thing. This is what my priority is. So you're just a little side thing. I'm not. I don't. And also, I think it was in some ways. I think the distraction of an eating disorder was really helpful in not having to be so caught up in the self-loathing of why am I not connecting the way that I want to? Why and kind of the over-analyzing that I now kind of have started to have to deal with of my social anxieties. That now that the eating disorder is no longer an issue, I think it was kind of a way to not have to deal with the social anxieties and how to and at one point in your book you mentioned shyness, and I think it's that where I couldn't handle being shy and feeling different and not feeling connected in the same way. So I don't have to deal with that if I can just deal with this. This is going to get my attention. This is going to get my energy. I think it was self-preservation, I guess. Unfortunately, it was self-destruction, but disguised as self-preservation.
Yeah, I mean, it's a coping mechanism. It's a way to cope with unbearable pain, and it's not a healthy coping mechanism. But you're right in that it covers up so much, because whenever you feel discomfort, if you eat or don't eat, then that's the feeling you're grappling with, instead of whatever it is that you don't want to feel that leads you to turn like toward or away from food in the first place. And as you know, that's such a big part of recovery is finally experiencing all those feelings and learning to sit with them.
It's so fascinating to me, you being a writer and experiencing this. How do you feel like eating disorders informed your writing? Did you feel like you were able to be articulate in other areas as long as it wasn't personal? Or did you feel like in some way your writing could transcend the eating disorders and you were able to access whatever truth you were experiencing at that time? I would love to know how writing and eating disorders go together, when to me, eating disorders are sort of a denial of truth and a rejection of reality, and writing is the truth.
That's a really interesting question about the relationship of eating disorders to my writing. I mean, I guess like a couple things. One, so when I started binging in my teens, a thing I would almost invariably do after a binge was write. It was sort of like my purge or like my ritual purification. I would just like write and write and write. And for a few pages, it would just be like, I hate myself. I hate myself. I can't believe it. And then like it would sort of give way to something more like insightful and hopeful. And, writing made me feel like everything would be okay. And the binges, I feel like with good reason, there's a lot of sensitivity when we talk about eating disorders to not make these behaviors seem appealing in any way. But on the other hand, I also think it's important to name their power, because otherwise nobody understands why a person would do this crazy thing.
Yes.
But so the binges, like they were obviously really destructive, but they also had this kind of generative quality for me. After I stopped binging and swung back to anorexia, it was harder for me to access that kind of fluidity and creativity. I mean, part of it is because when you're anorexic, you have no energy. You're exhausted.
Yeah.
You have no glucose. Your brain can't think.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt really clenched. And I would write a sentence. I would erase the sentence. I would write the sentence again. Like I didn't write much at all. But, as I moved through my adulthood, when I started writing this book was meant to be a different book and sort of a cultural history of the teenage girl intertwined with some of the story of my own adolescence. But really, when I wrote the first draft, what came out instead of this cultural history was this very personal history of my eating disorders. And, it took me a really long time to admit that's what I wanted to write about. And that material was really urgent and unresolved for me, but it was also the material that on the page had the most power. It had the most feeling. And I think that's because over the years, I had transferred so much feeling into food, right? Like I'd turned to food instead of to people. I'd turned to food and it had consumed so much of my attention. So of course there was like electricity and power when I put it down on the page, because that's sadly where like a lot of the electricity and power was in my life. I mean, I'm making things sound like a lot bleaker than they truly were. But I do think that at its essence, that there's a reason that I wrote the book that I did. And it's partly because it was a book I needed to write, but it was also because that became the thing I knew how to write about with feeling, if that makes sense.
No, 100%. I totally get it. Do you feel that eating disorders are an addiction? Are they induced by a traumatic incident? I feel like there's a lot of debate on where eating disorders, on what they are, on where they fall on the spectrum of anything. They're so hard to define. Do you define them? Do you find defining them helpful? I feel like putting a name, labeling things can ultimately be helpful. That's kind of where I stand. But I'm curious for your thoughts on how you quantify them, if you do.
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I mean, they're multi-determined and multifaceted. I mean, I will say that binge eating for me, like I experienced as a compulsion. I experienced it as an addiction. I know that there's there's a lot of debate about what an addiction even is, if food can be addictive, if the addiction is behavioral or to a substance. But But my experience of binge eating, it mirrored, my mother is sober now, but she was drinking in my teens. My addiction to food mirrored her addiction to alcohol. In my mind, I will say that thinking of binge eating as an addiction was something that was helpful to me. It helped me make sense of the behavior. I do think that, however, wherever one puts eating disorders, I think that one message that is so important is that they are illnesses that can be treated and that they are mental illnesses. I think that sometimes people think, oh, it's my fault. If I were just better, I could fix this. And I do think it's helpful to put it in a category. No, it's an illness that can be treated. I mean, how did you feel like it was an addiction for you?
100%. And I agree that putting that label on it was helpful in terms of recovery. It was a thing that I constantly thought, well, I'll get a handle on it tomorrow. Well, I'll figure it out tomorrow. Well, today's a wash, so I better just get over today, and then tomorrow I will reset. It was constantly obsessed with tomorrow and ruining today based on what I had eaten or not eaten or gotten rid of. It was always about that. But then once I realized through therapy, once my therapist sat me down and told me the realities of it, that was when I was able to go, okay, so if it's an addiction and I treat it like an addiction and I use the tools that he's telling me, then that means there's a chance of improvement. It's not all on my shoulders. It's not this thing that I'm in alone. This is a thing that many people have dealt with and many people have overcome, and I hope more and more will continue to overcome. But having that identifier was tremendously helpful for me, which is, I think, why they are so hard to quantify, but why I feel so passionately about finding ways to define them, because it was such a helpful part of my recovery. It really it was. I would love to go into the hierarchy of eating disorders, which is a thing that I feel like nobody talks about, but that is so real and so scary and so sick, but so important. Why don't you give me the idea of what you mean when you say hierarchy? Because I feel like I know what you mean, but just in case listeners don't.
For sure. I mean, so when I use the word hierarchy, I think in the beginning of the book, I'm talking about so when I was growing up in the 80s, there was anorexia and there was bulimia, and then I had binge eating disorder, which didn't really have a name in those years outside of psychological journals. There was no, TV movie about binge eating disorder. So anorexia and bulimia were kind of the stars. And anorexia, it's the one that somebody with anorexia is assumed to be, in control. Somebody with bulimia is out of control.
Yep.
Binge eating disorder, I think that people often don't even understand that it counts. It just seems so JV. It's just oh, you're eating a pint of ice cream once in a while in the kitchen. Oh, boo-hoo. You know what I mean? I think that people don't understand it as a compulsion. And, I do think that with bulimia and with binge eating disorder, there's an aggression. And I think that there's a reaction of disgust on the part of the culture that even though anorexia, even though there may be a disgust reaction in seeing somebody who is emaciated or skeletal, I feel like there's a harsher judgment of bulimia and binge eating disorder.
Absolutely.
Sorry, that was kind of a messy explanation of the hierarchy. But did you, so you kind of hit all 3 points in that. So did you, in your head, did you kind of experience it as a hierarchy? You know what I mean?
Oh my God, 100%. Anorexia for me meant I was doing well. I did feel in control. I felt light and even though it was a complete warped sense of reality, I can't emphasize that enough, a complete denial, so deeply, deeply troubled as I see it now. In those moments, it felt like I was floating. I could handle anything. I will be successful. I will accomplish whatever I need to accomplish. It felt, at one point, I think you say the beginning of anorexia is like heroin before it wrecks you. That is, oh my God, it just feels like this is incredible. I can do anything. I am going to achieve anything. Bulimia. So for me, when anorexia, binge eating, bulimia, binge eating felt like shame, felt like undeserving, felt like worthlessness, complete disappointment with myself, a failure, the lowest of low. And then bulimia to me felt like constant chaos and hell and frantic and manic. Yeah. So if that kind of paints somewhat of a picture of where my psyche was at with each of them, but each one equally disturbed in their own way, but and equally painful, but so different. So different. I also felt like there's this, because there's such a stigma around eating disorders, I would feel like, well, I'm not pretty enough to have an eating disorder. People who have eating disorders are pretty. They're the pretty girl. They're the one who all the boys are chasing, who's got all the friends, and then they also have an eating disorder because that kind of like fits their identity. So it was. I think it kind of played into my denial that I could use these judgments toward people who have eating disorders and kind of avoid my own by just, well, I'm not pretty enough for that, or then the other one that was kind of me bolstering myself in the denial of it was, well, I'm too cool for eating disorders. I play this cool character on TV. I'm like the cool girl. I'm the one that everybody wants to hang with. I'm not the girl sitting in the corner.
Right? I mean, that whole thing of I'm not good enough to have an eating disorder. Like it's so part of it's like a symptom of the illness itself. It's so part of the personality matrix that just predisposes one to an eating disorder. Like I'm not good enough. And then the way you describe the mood of each one, I just think that's so good because it's like, eating disorders, right? They all have the same function in the end. They're all doing the same thing, whether you're not eating or eating too much or eating and throwing up. It's all serving the same function to dissociate or to numb or to like not deal with uncomfortable feelings. But the concrete experiences of them are very different. And just the way you laid them out, like the kind of high of anorexia and the like manic quality of bulimia and the shame of binging. Yeah. That's like you did a really nice job with that.
Oh, thank you. Did you ever feel like you're going to Yale? Did you ever feel, oh my God, I'm too smart for this? Or was it that you were in the denial of them so much that you couldn't quite get to the outside of them to think even something like that?
No, I didn't feel like I was too smart for them. I definitely felt like I was wasting my life. I definitely felt like I was wasting, I was missing out on stuff and I was wasting time. I was losing time. But no, I didn't feel like it was a problem. I don't know. It's interesting. Yeah, I didn't. And somebody asked me not long ago, did I feel like as a feminist, like I shouldn't have these problems? And I also unfortunately never felt that either. Maybe if I had, I could have gotten over them. No, it was just like I couldn't see outside of it. You know what I mean? It was just like my relationship to them was like, I don't want this to be happening to me, but it is happening to me and I'm not getting help and it keeps happening.
Right. So then in college is when you met your now husband?
Mm-hmm.
So what do you think that in some ways, where do you tie meeting him into your recovery? I ask because I felt that meeting my now partner was deeply instrumental in my recovery. I was still at the early I had already entered recovery on my own before meeting him, or before we began going out. But it was a very sensitive time in my recovery. And I think being able to be intimate with him, probably the first time I've really been able to access genuine intimacy with somebody, was key in being able to fully plant myself in myself separate from eating disorders. So what was that like for you with meeting your now husband, and how did that play into the avoiding intimacy within eating disorders and then finding this intimacy over here? How did that kind of play out?
I mean, I think maybe similarly as it sounds like it has for you. I mean, he was somebody who I felt always just saw me. So when we met, it was freshman year. And, when I was binging, I was heavy. I was in a bigger body than I am now. And I had a lot of shame about that. But with him, I rarely was conscious of my body. I mean, I'm not going to say I was never conscious of my body, because I was always very conscious of my body in those years. But he really saw me. And I felt like there was always, I was always hiding parts of myself, pretending to be somebody I wasn't. And with him, I really didn't feel the need to do that. And so I was able to achieve intimacy with him. At the same time, the binging was something I never told him about. He didn't know about it until I had a finished manuscript of the book. Anorexia was something he was aware of because he knew me then and he lived through it, and we struggled with that. I think he didn't know how preoccupied by food I remained during our adulthood. I mean, it definitely came up in our relationship a bunch, issues of anxiety and control. But I think he didn't understand, because I don't think I understood. I think I just thought that I was like preoccupied with food. I think I was in denial about sort of how actively eating disordered I was. But, we have a new and deeper intimacy now that we're able to talk about this stuff. And it has been, I mean, it's a total cliche, but like it has been really amazing, like to say this stuff to him. And now there's so much more that can be said for both of us. It's really extraordinary.
Yeah, I feel like eating disorders in so many ways do stunt kind of the development of the self. Like I kind of look back on 11 to 24 as just a pause button on my life. I have so much regret toward, you mentioned, feeling that fear of wasting time. And I feel that. I feel like I imagine what I could have done, what I could have put my energy into that wasn't that. And I think the consequences of them are devastating. And I just hope, I just hope that there's something that can be done for future generations and for anybody out there now who might be experiencing this, where they can pivot in their adolescence and not wait until adulthood to kind of put the pieces together, because those are key years to miss out on. That's an important part of you that you just press pause on because of these addictions. My question for you is, go ahead.
Yeah. No, I mean, I do think it's so important. And I do think that that talking about this stuff and telling stories about it is so important. I mean, I am so curious to ask you about what prompted you to tell your story. Like when you wrote that piece for the HuffPost, I'm always so interested in what makes somebody like ready to tell or want to tell. Yeah. And I'm just really curious about what led up to that for you.
That's a good question. I felt, first and most importantly, I felt sturdy enough in my recovery that I could share my story. I knew from where my mental health had been in the thick of the eating disorders that if I had spoken too soon, opening up, hey, I have struggled with eating disorders, to the public and more specifically to social media is like not exactly inviting the positivity of the world into your life. So I knew that I had to be really, really sturdy so that anything that might bleed, I try to stay away from comment sections and all that jazz, but like anything that might bleed in, I wanted to know that was not going to in any way set back my recovery. So that was kind of the first step. And then second was that the anger was a huge motivator for me. Really the anger in the time that I had wasted, and feeling like if I can get through to one young woman, like it's very important for me to communicate with young women, adolescents. If I can get through to one of them who can stop while they're ahead, stop just as they're dipping the toe into it and save them years, that would be incredible. I wish that eating disorders, I feel like now they're kind of reaching this interesting time where they are becoming more talked about, and that's very exciting and I hope very helpful. But when I was younger, they still weren't talked about in the way that they are now. And I think it would have been incredibly helpful if I had just seen one person kind of being honest about their experience, the highs, the lows, the ugliness of it, with some perspective on it. If I had just stumbled on anything like that, I think it could have helped. I like to think it could have helped jog me out of the denial and hopefully jump-started my recovery, but I didn't have access to any of that material. So I was kind of hoping that maybe it would just, I guess, help somebody who was, help some young woman out there, I guess.
Yeah.
It's a very broad explanation, but I don't know if that kind of explains it.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, no, and I think it does. It does help. It does help. And I also think like it just shows a lot of self-knowledge too, that you waited till you were a point where you were like sturdy, because of course it opens you up to all kinds of stuff.
Yeah. How has that been for you with coming out with this memoir? Was this, I know you've written articles in the past, so it seems like you already had some familiarity with the eating disorder community and kind of opened yourself up and opened yourself up to it. But I'm imagining it was very scary to come out with this memoir and kind of bear it all. Was it more intimidating or was it more of a relief for you?
It's interesting. I mean, I feel like I'm still figuring out what that has felt like. I feel it's a little weird because this book came out in June. So it's like we're in the middle of the pandemic. And so I'm talking about the book a lot. People I'm close to now know about, my secret. My coworkers now know about my secret. But like I'm not physically in a space with others. And I feel like there's something about that makes it different, or maybe I could be wrong. Maybe it's just that I expected to feel differently than I do. I mean, I think that the thing that's the most different is working toward recovery. Like I think that I've always been really drawn to telling and confession, and sharing information as a route to intimacy has been something that has really obsessed me. But I think the thing that is the most different is continuing to tell the secret over and over to my therapist is working toward recovery. That's the thing that makes me feel the most different, and trying to understand why I felt the need to keep a secret in the first place is something that I'm working on now.
I want to be mindful of your time here. We're almost out. I'm very bummed about that. But if you don't mind, I just kind of got a couple final questions to wrap up, and then we'll let you go. Great. Where would you say you're at with your recovery now? Do you think recovered is a point that is attainable? Would you say that you are recovered, or is it something, or do you think that recovery is kind of a thing that's on a continuum?
I'm definitely still working toward recovery. Definitely not recovered. I will say at the beginning, I remember, so I didn't start therapy until almost 2 years ago. And in one of the early sessions,
Okay. Wow.
So I waited until I had a finished draft of the manuscript. I was really scared of letting anyone in. And at the first session, I told my therapist that I was there for two reasons. One, I had this book. There was the secret that was going to come out, and I thought there were probably consequences for revealing a secret so publicly that a shrink could help me work through. But second, I was fixated on food. I was preoccupied with food, and I didn't want to be. And she was like, well, you always think about food because you don't eat enough of it. And yes, she was right. But there was still part of me then that's like, okay, even if I do nourish myself, there's just part of my brain that's always going to be obsessed with food. I'm just one of those people. I'm never going to have a typical relationship with food. I do feel differently now. I feel like I have enough glimmers of what it's like to have that more typical relationship with food, to savor food, to take pleasure in it. And I do see that as a real possibility for me, as something that I am working toward.
Wow.
But, to go back to the addiction model, right? Like food isn't, we always, it's a tricky one because it's not just a substance we can cut out. We have to learn to live with it.
Yeah.
So in that sense, yes, recovery is always ongoing. How, like, what about for you? I'm really curious.
I would say, I almost feel guilty about it, in a strange way, but I would say I feel recovered. I'm also a little scared of saying recovered because then, of course, that the implications of that and what happens if then I have a relapse and then how do I face that, whatever those fears are. But there was this key part in my recovery. I did a form of therapy that mixed DBT and another type of therapy called schema therapy. And it was specifically for eating disorders, and that was really helpful for me. But something that was kind of a big moment was I went into my therapist maybe a year in and had said, now that I'm doing a lot better, like I'm not fixated on, I no longer was engaging in harmful behaviors. And also my obsession with food had really waned because of course that's the thing I feel like that lingers far past the problematic behaviors. So when that started going away, I was like, I feel like I have all this extra time now where the anxiety is cropping up, the depression is cropping up. I'm now feeling things for the first time, and I don't know what to do with all this extra time on my hands. Like I'm realizing when I say literal hours upon hours of every day that we're going to are just me thinking about food, that's the truth. Like I didn't know how to fill that time anymore. And I said, I think the best thing for me is going to be to come up with a different obsession. Like I need something else to obsess over because my mind's going to want to obsess about something. So I might as well find something constructive. And that was when I switched into really focusing on writing and creating my own projects. And if anything, that is, I have maybe an unhealthy obsession on that, like a constant kind of fixation and, well, I got to do this and I got to do that. And so I guess the obsessive part of my mind is still very much intact, but it is no longer toward food, which is a welcome thing for me. I feel a lot of relief and happiness about that.
Well, I mean, I think it's so great that you can say it. And I think it's great to say it and also be like, I'm scared of saying this, but here it goes. I'm going to say it. Like, I'm happy for you.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah. Recovery was not at all what I thought it would be. I thought that it would be an immediate, like I would know the instant I was recovered and it would just be an easy path, but recovery was in many ways as bumpy as the eating disorders themselves because it was me coming to terms with myself for the first time in however many years the eating disorders had been keeping myself on the back burner.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's another thing that's so important for people to understand about recovery from an eating disorder is that like therapy for one, it's not just changing the behaviors. It's like understanding, the underlying reasons for the behavior in the first place. And that's like where the real transformation and like real power of recovery is in discovering yourself and feels really exciting when you get to that place.
Yeah, absolutely. Last question. What is the advice that you would have given to your younger self when you were in those moments where you were struggling most?
I mean, this is hard because I don't know that my younger self would have listened, but I get you. But the thing that has been the most important piece of this for me is going to therapy. Is food is like a one-person solution. Going to therapy and talking about this stuff with another, you learn. A two-person solution. I don't think that an eating disorder is something you can fix on your own. You need another person. So if there's any way I could have opened my younger self up to the possibility of talking to another person about this stuff, that's what I would say. And I think the other thing I would tell her, though, because I do think that finding the right person matters.
Yes,
it's not always easy.
Yes, yeah.
And like, and so like if I didn't, my mother and my father are wonderful. And my mother, I didn't have, I do think there are parents who are like, okay, here's your therapist, go. But that it might not be the right therapist, right? Like you might need to meet with more than one person. It might take a while, but it's worth it to spend that time.
I could not agree more. Thank you so much for doing this. I am so delighted to have spoken with you, and I've been looking forward to it since we put it on the books. So I so appreciate your time and your insights and your writing.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed talking to you. It's really meaningful to me to connect with other people who've had this experience. So thank you for talking to me. I really, really appreciate it.
Yeah. So specific, isn't it?
It really is. Yeah.